And now? Better?
But it's on.
Your mic isn't on. Nobody can hear you back here.
We're working on it. Better? Okay. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the November edition of Cafe Scientifique. So tonight we're going to have speaking Dr. Sophia Johansson. She is a research scientist who works at the Institute for Ocean Sciences. She has been an adjunct at the University of Victoria, as well as an instructor and a collaborator and co-author. So she is a geochemical oceanographer, and she studies particles and their fate in the water column from the surface all the way down to the bottom where they accumulate. She's looked at things like the fate of bitumen if there's a spill at sea, to the effect of climate change on coastal ecosystems, the burial of carbon, the fate of things that come out of municipal wastewater. And she's worked from the Arctic Ocean to most recently the Antarctic. So with that, I give you Dr. Sophia Johansson.
Hello, can you hear me? Excellent. So you can't hear me? More, be louder? Okay. Well, I'm going to try and stay close to this microphone, but I'm used to walking around when I talk, so it's possible I'll walk away. If you can't hear me at any point, just wave your arms around and I'll remember to go back to the mic, okay? Thank you all for coming out on this cold, wet November night. I'm glad to see you all out here. I'm going to be talking about climate change and blue carbon. I'm going to divide this into 3 pieces so that all of you can keep track of where we are in the presentation, and so I hope I don't lose where I am either. So I'm going to begin with a section about climate change and the carbon cycle. Then the second part will be about blue carbon. What is blue carbon and how could it be used for climate change mitigation? And the third part will be about, so what can we do and what might we expect to achieve? Well, first of all, beginning with the climate change part. Put your hand up, please, if you feel confident that you understand why the climate is changing. I promise I won't call on you to explain it. I just want a sense of how confident the people in this room are about why climate change is happening. Well, that's most people. That's great. Good to hear. I hope you're all thinking something along the lines of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But even though this is a pretty confident group, I'd like to start at the beginning because make sure we're all in the same place, because there are some pretty odd ideas out there. Just last year I saw online a short video made for a children's environmental camp where they included a little video about how climate change worked. And they began by saying, put your hands together like this, hold them over your mouth, and breathe out. Do you feel that warmth? That's carbon dioxide, and that's why the world is getting warmer. So I don't want any of you to take this as an explanation and tell your friends, please. That's wrong. Carbon dioxide is not warm inherently. In fact, the reason why the excess carbon dioxide is warming the planet is that carbon dioxide acts like the glass in a greenhouse. It allows visible light through in either direction, from the sun down or from the earth back up. But it doesn't allow heat through. It absorbs heat. So sunlight comes in, and if some of it just bounces off the surface and goes back out, and that's why you can see the Earth from space. There's light reflected back out. But some of the light that comes in is absorbed by things at the surface of the Earth and then re-emitted as heat. And that heat can't get out. It's absorbed in the lower atmosphere. And since the Industrial Revolution, humans have added more and more carbon dioxide into the lower atmosphere. First, it was by land clearing for farming and for cities and just general development. But more and more over time, that's been due to fossil fuels. So as coal, oil, and gas, and as we burn those fossil fuels, that adds even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And now the proportions are more like 90% of fossil fuel to only about 10% land clearing. So about 90% of the human emissions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere come from fossil burning now. So luckily for us, in a way, I suppose we might have had warning sooner if it hadn't, but in a way, the ocean has protected us against the worst effects of climate change. It has absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. It's also absorbed about 40% of the excess carbon dioxide. Now that's come at a cost to the ocean. The cost is ocean acidification. That's a whole other topic that I'm not planning to talk about in detail here. But I'll just say that makes it harder for organisms like oysters that make calcium carbonate shells to form their shells, and it's bad for some other animals too, for their metabolism. So the ocean has taken a hit for us by absorbing the heat and the CO2, but it's changing. And also, as you get more and more carbon dioxide absorbed from the atmosphere into the ocean, it becomes harder to put more in. So the rate of uptake, it can't continue at the rate it is. It will continue to take up carbon dioxide as long as there's higher concentration in the atmosphere, but it won't keep going as fast as it has. So since the problem causing climate change is due to carbon dioxide, it helps to understand how the carbon cycle works. You probably all learned about the hydrological cycle in school, about how water is evaporated from the ocean, goes up into clouds, floats along, and eventually rains down again onto the land and runs back to the ocean through rivers. The modern carbon cycle is quite like that. Carbon dioxide can move around among different compartments of the Earth. So from the atmosphere to the surface ocean, vegetation and surface sediments and soils, it's quite easy to move carbon dioxide around. If you plant a tree, you can suck some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you burn a tree, and it goes back out again. But and the theory behind that is as plants grow, they take in carbon dioxide, they turn it into organic carbon in their leaves and their stems, their trunks if they're trees, and then when they break down again or die, they release the carbon dioxide again. But some portion of that carbon that goes into the plants is buried in the sediments for a short time if it's near the surface, or possibly if it gets buried deeper, it can stay in for longer. So the timescales we're talking about in the modern carbon cycle are from seconds for some of the photosynthesis processes, days, seasons, years, even decades for surface sediments, and hundreds of years to 1,000 years for the deep ocean. But all of those timescales are very short compared with the timescale for fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, have been isolated from the modern carbon system for hundreds of millions of years. And when we burn them, we're putting essentially new carbon. It's ancient carbon, but it's coming new into the modern carbon system. So we're adding more and more with time. And unfortunately, there's no natural process to take it back out again on a timescale that's relevant to humans. Sure, we can move it around. As I say, you plant some more trees, you can plant some seagrasses, you can move some temporarily out. But to get it fully out of that modern system, the processes are slower, longer. Rock weathering, which takes hundreds of thousands of years, or the reformation of fossil fuels, which takes hundreds of millions of years. So long as we continue to add fossil carbon into the modern system, the concentration in the atmosphere is going to continue to increase. And if we have increasing emissions, the concentration in the atmosphere and the temperature will increase very fast. If we have stable emissions, the temperature will continue to increase, but less quickly. If we have declining emissions, the temperature will still continue to increase, but more slowly. We won't stop the temperature increase until we stop adding additional carbon into this modern system, until we reach zero or an effective kind of net zero for carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. At that point, the temperature will stabilize within a few years, but it won't go back down. Not within a time frame that we notice, because of that 100,000-year time scale I was talking about before for sucking CO2 out of the modern system. And so because of that, because we've got this problem with climate change that's causing all these effects that we see in droughts and floods and sea level rise and lots of other things besides, and because there isn't a way to get this excess carbon out quickly in a natural way, people start to think about methods for climate change mitigation. There are two general classes. One of them is solar radiation management, and the other is carbon dioxide removal. Solar radiation management ignores the carbon cycle completely. And for that, it's just about bouncing light back into space. There are some ideas like putting space mirrors up in orbit all around the Earth and reflecting the light back out to the sun. Or about space, I suppose. The sun doesn't have to catch it. There are other ideas include injecting particles into the stratosphere to try and make little aerosols form particles up in the stratosphere that will reflect sunlight out. Because if it comes in as visible light, and it can get back out again, remember, visible light can get back out through the carbon dioxide, it's only the heat that can't. And another idea for solar radiation management is to put lots of bubbles all over the surface of the ocean and make the ocean very white, make it reflect light as well. But there are three problems with this. One of them is, and this comes to mind first as an oceanographer, that it doesn't deal at all with the carbon dioxide problem itself. And it means that the ocean will continue to become more and more acidic with time, because the carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater and forms carbonic acid at the surface, and that's what leads to this ocean acidification that I was mentioning. The second one is that there can be all kinds of strange side effects, some of which we can anticipate and some we just can't. So the aerosol injection one, for example, could cause huge changes in regional weather. It might change where the monsoon is or whether it happens at all, for example. So huge changes, and there are probably things that we can't even anticipate that would happen there. And the third thing is that if you turn it off again, if you stop injecting the aerosols into the atmosphere, or you take away the mirrors, and you have in the meantime continued to increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then the sunlight's going to come right back in, and it's going to heat the world rapidly according to that new high concentration of carbon dioxide. So some people still feel that perhaps one day we will be using solar radiation management, but there's another whole class of climate change mitigation called carbon dioxide removal, which actually is intended to deal with with carbon dioxide itself. These climate change mitigation measures are, well, scientists would say they're not any substitute for stopping fossil fuel emissions. We get to that part later. But besides stopping fossil fuel emissions, there are these two kinds of climate change mitigation. So carbon dioxide removal can look like large-scale geoengineering, like grinding up huge amounts of limestone, sprinkling them all over the surface of the ocean to make it dissolve in the water, make the ocean water become more alkaline so that it can absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. And that could potentially stay in there for a time scale of thousands of years or so. Other ideas include sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, making it liquid, and injecting it into new basaltic rocks where it can react with the fresh rocks and we could form a crystal and stay there for a long time. And there are lots of other things, some of them that just sound like science fiction. But all of these things have unknown effectiveness and unknown risks. And so the other kind of climate change mitigation measure that people consider often is nature-based solutions. And these feel more comfortable to people because we don't know of any way in which they're going to entirely destroy life on Earth, as perhaps might happen with some of these others. So they just feel a little bit safer. And they're things, and they have really good benefits, like planting trees that provides habitat, provides food security in some cases. And one that has come to the fore and has had a lot of attention paid to it recently is blue carbon, which is blue carbon. So I need to stop there for a second, just acknowledge to keep us on track that I got to the end of my climate change piece. I'm about to move on to the blue carbon piece. just take a breath there. I'm used to speaking with slides, so normally I can stride around and point at things, and I don't forget where I am in my talk. But anyway, here we are, we're done. Oh, pretty much on time too. Okay, so blue carbon. Blue carbon is carbon that's stored in the plants and sediments of vegetated coastal ecosystems. In Canada, that means seagrass meadows and salt marshes. In tropical areas, it also includes mangroves. The theory here is that these plants, as they're growing, take in carbon dioxide, store it in their stems and leaves, and some of it goes also into the sediment, where it could be stored for some amount of time. There has been a huge amount of excitement about this in the media. You see completely otherwise responsible media outlets saying things like, blue carbon, the secret superpower that will save the planet. But the thing is, they're not just making this stuff up. They're getting it directly from the scientists in the blue carbon community. There is a paper, a well-cited paper, for example, that says that although seagrass meadows cover only 0.1% of the ocean area, they absorb more than 50% of the carbon that goes into the ocean. So that makes them sound extremely important. But that's one community of scientists. There are other scientists, the oceanographers, geochemists, and climate modelers, who don't have such high hopes for blue carbon. I was at a meeting, an international meeting on the ocean carbon sink a year ago that was part of Canada's contribution to the G7. And on the first day of this meeting about the ocean carbon sink, somebody said, should we talk about blue carbon? And two people called him down at once saying, no, it's completely negligible, insignificant. And nobody mentioned it again for 2 days. So we have two communities of scientists here. We've got one community saying, this is the biggest thing ever to happen and it's our way out of climate change. And the other community not even bothering to talk about it because they think it's so insignificant. So I think what we have here is a communication problem. We're used to communication problems between scientists and the media. But in this case, I think we have a communication problem between groups of scientists. And the way that this has come up is that blue carbon has, remember I mentioned maybe I didn't mention so clearly, nature-based solutions have many co-benefits. And in blue carbon in particular, these vegetated ecosystems are really, really important. They provide critical habitat for invertebrates and fish, stopping over places for migratory seabirds. They protect our shorelines against erosion during big storms. And they provide opportunities for tourism and food security as well. So they're very important ecosystems, and there are lots of good reasons to protect them. And I think that blue carbon grew out of a community of biologists and ecologists who understand very well the science of seagrasses and salt marshes and the biodiversity of the animals that live there. But they didn't know anything about marine sediments or how sediments bury or process carbon. And they didn't know that there was anything to know, which is not surprising. I mean, I didn't know about I'm a marine geochemist, and I've worked on organic carbon in sediments for 20 years or 25 years, maybe it is now. And I didn't know about blue carbon until I just stumbled across the field in 2013, just sort of by accident when I was asked to review a proposal. So if geochemists don't know about blue carbon, maybe it's not that surprising that the blue carbon scientists didn't know about geochemistry either. So there are, it turns out, three is going to come up all the time. There are three big problems with the blue carbon things about the importance of blue carbon for climate change mitigation. And to understand the first one is magnitude. The effect is not nearly so big as is claimed. The second is that there's a mismatch in time scale between the short-term storage in vegetation and vegetated ecosystems and the long-term time scales for carbon cycles. And the third is a misunderstanding about avoided emissions, which we'll get to. For the magnitude part, you need to understand a little bit about sediments and where they come from. So all the time in the ocean, underwater, there's weather. Particles are falling down from the surface all through the water column to the bottom. It's not always the same stuff. It's not the same composition or the same amount. It's not the same from one place to another. This rain of particles reflects what's happening at the surface of the ocean and through the water column. If there's a big phytoplankton bloom, then the particles will be mainly dead phytoplankton, or if the zooplankton have eaten them on the way, it'll be zooplankton poop. If there's been a big rainstorm or a melt event high in the mountains, then rivers will wash down ground up rocks and leaves from land. Or if there's a big jellyfish bloom, you get little bits of stingers and jellyfish tentacles. And all these things fall down through the water. Most of it gets eaten on the way, but some arrives at the bottom, and it preserves a history of what's happened above. And then we can go along, and so first, new layers land on top of old layers, and they build up a history in the mud, which is useful for studying contaminants, for example, or other things like organic carbon. And we go along then and collect a sediment core, which is just a tube of mud down through we just take it down from the surface of the mud down as far as we can get the tube in. And we take this out and we can analyze, we can make chemical analysis of the different layers in the core. We can figure out how fast the sediment is building up and what the composition is, and we can learn about the history of the water above, and we can learn about what happens to things like organic carbon once they get into the sediment. This core is from near the Macaulay outfall, but don't worry, it's old and it's been laminated, so it's completely clean to hold, except it's like a dusty thing. I might just pass it around in case anyone wants to have a look at it. So these layers build up a history, and if we were in a lake or in an anoxic basin of the ocean where there's no oxygen at the bottom, like Saanich Inlet, that would be the end of the story. The history would be there, you'd see all the layers, and you'd know exactly what was going on. But in almost the entire ocean, there are little animals that live in the mud at the bottom of the ocean. There are sea creatures and crabs and clams and worms, so many worms, so many horrible shapes of really worms, fat ones, little ones. Anyway, they stir around this sediment. And on average, globally, they stir it to a depth of about 10 centimeters. In seagrass meadows, it actually is a little deeper because not only are the bugs doing their bioturbation, sorry, I know they're not bugs, I apologize to any biologists, but the animals, not only the animals stirring to about a depth of 10 centimeters or so, but with seagrass meadows, they're in quite shallow water, intertidal or shallow subtidal, and so they get mixed around by waves as well. So this sediment is quite mixed. Now, here's the first problem with the magnitude of the estimate of blue carbon. Blue carbon estimates were done by sprinkling a layer of white ground sediment in a meadow, seagrass meadow, then going away and coming back a few years later and seeing they would find the deepest depth where they could find some of their white rock, and then they would assume that all the sediment above that had accumulated in the time since they sprinkled their rock. Well, remember these bugs stirring things around. You might have a sedimentation rate of 1 millimeter per year, but if you have bugs there stirring it down to 10 centimeters or with waves 20 centimeters, and that's how you're calculating your sedimentation rate, you're going to end up with a number that's much too high. The second part also relates to these animals in the sediment. They don't just stir things around for fun, they're eating as well as making burrows. And so a lot of the organic carbon, when it arrives in the surface sediment, still has quite a lot of energy in it that's good for animals, so they eat it. So they eat some of it, and as it goes deeper in the core, there's a little bit less that's good, and they eat that. And then you get below the depth of the sea cucumbers and clams and things, and you get down to bacteria. They still keep eating some of it too, until finally you get to a depth, usually it's around 25 centimeters or so, beyond which it does vary from one environment to another, beyond which the animals can't, or bacteria even, can't extract any energy by eating any more of the carbon, and then the remainder of that tends to get buried. But the blue carbon scientists invariably took their organic carbon concentrations from the surface of the sediment. So their concentrations were much too high because most of that organic carbon was going to get eaten. It wasn't being buried. And so if they're trying to calculate what's the burial rate of carbon in this seagrass meadow and how much can it draw down for CO2, they're forgetting that a lot of that is not going to get eaten and return to carbon dioxide. So they take these organic carbon numbers that are too high, and they multiply them by their sedimentation rates that are already too high, and end up with a number that's even more too high. And then the third part of that was that these initial measurements were made in the Mediterranean, in an area where there was a very large species of seagrass in the genus of Posidonia. They grow very large, they're evergreen essentially, and they make enormous root mats. And so they actually do produce and bury more organic carbon than many of our stragglier little seagrasses that grow in our coarse sediment up here. And so what they did was they took their numbers that were too high for their organic carbon burial rates, and they multiplied them by the whole world's area where seagrasses could grow. And that was how they came up with their numbers. So a geochemical analysis from 2016 showed that the global estimates for how much carbon you could bury due to the seagrass meadows was too high by a factor of somewhere between 10 and 3,000 times. So it seems, I know I spend a lot of time talking about methodology, and it seems like maybe this could just be a pedantic difference, but it's really not. If all they did was say, these seagrasses are really important habitats and we should protect them, and by the way, they also store some carbon, so that's a bonus, that would be fine. But the problem is that then people started wanting to claim carbon credits for them. And if they then take an overestimated carbon burial rate and use that to offset an emission somewhere else, then the net effect is an increase in emissions to the atmosphere, exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. The second problem with the blue carbon claims is about timescale. Remember I was telling you about the difference in timescale between the modern carbon system and how old fossil fuels are and how long rock weathering takes to remove the carbon dioxide again from the system. Well, some of the calculations involve drawdown into plant material. And the plant material, at least in our part of the world, grows in the summer and dies in the winter. So your storage time scale is about 6 months. Or if you skip that one. Or if you're instead looking at a burial in the sediments, the part of the carbon that is only in the surface sediments may only be buried for a year or so. If it gets deeper, it can be decades, centuries. If you get very deep, I mean, eventually that is where the long-term sink for carbon in the ocean, it does eventually get down there, but only a very tiny amount of the carbon makes it down into that deep long-term storage. And so when you compare that with our 100,000-year time scale for actually removing it from the modern system, you can see that it's not a fair comparison to say this salt marsh buries as much carbon as are produced by 50,000 cars, which is a claim that I've seen, and many similar ones as well. It's not an equivalency. You can't make a real net zero where you've got one thing that is going to store carbon for 10 years or 100 years, and another that's producing carbon that's going to stay in our system for hundreds of thousands of years. The third problem is avoided emissions credits. So this is again carbon credits, but a different kind. And you might have heard about this for forests. Sometimes instead of saying we're going to plant more trees or we're going to plant more seagrasses, people just say we're going to protect something. Because if it's not protected, there is a good chance that the carbon could be released again. And I mean, that's true. Seagrass meadows are threatened by development and climate change, by sea level rise and marine heat waves. So there's a chance that some of the stored carbon can be released again. But here's how the math works for these carbon avoided emissions credits. Someone will say, there's a ton of carbon stored in this salt marsh, and I'm going to protect it and offset that with an emission of a ton of carbon somewhere else. Here's an example from France. It's a story that a French economist told me. Just recently, because of the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, France was unable to get oil or gas from Russia, and so instead they had to open an old coal burning plant again. The coal burning plant was required to offset its emissions, and so one of the things it did was to pay to protect a salt marsh and protect all the carbon stored there. It sounds good, the salt marsh was protected, good for the animals that live there and everything, but from the perspective of the atmosphere, let's say it was a ton of carbon in that marsh. There was 1 ton of carbon in this marsh, then it's protected, there is still 1 ton of carbon in the marsh. So from the point of view of the atmosphere, there's been zero change, no change at all. And then they emit a ton of carbon from this coal-fired generating plant. You can see that the math doesn't work at all. All these avoided emissions credits do is increase emissions. All the atmosphere sees is the permitted extra emission. It doesn't see the zero change where you've protected something that was already there. So blue carbon, the problems with it, magnitude and time scale, and these avoided emissions credits. And now that I've thoroughly depressed you all, I'd like to move on to the third section where things get a little better. I think one of the big problems with climate change is that it seems so big and complicated and intractable a problem. Sometimes it can seem like a bucket of snakes where all the problems are tangled around each other and they're all moving, and no matter what you grab, you're going to get bitten. And I think that it is our job as scientists and as educated people to help take those snakes out of the bucket, lay them down one by one, side by side, and say, okay, here's a problem. Here's how we can address it. Here's what we might hope to achieve. Here's a different problem. Here's how we can address this one, and here's what we can hope to achieve. I thought of this because I've noticed how people are really mixing together different types of problems. I was in the doctor's office one day, I'll just tell you the story. I was in the waiting room, there was a new receptionist, and she didn't know me. And there was nobody else there. She was so full of climate anxiety that it just started bubbling out of her. And she just started talking to me about the things that were worrying her. And one thing that she said was, there's no point in buying an electric car because even though you're stopping the CO2 emissions at the same time, you're causing all that pollution from mining for the batteries. But you see, those are completely separate problems. This excess CO2 in the atmosphere is an existential threat to life on the planet. And it can be addressed mainly by stopping fossil fuel emissions, and also potentially later by some of these other climate mitigation measures. The pollution from the batteries, that's a local problem, and it's something that can be addressed by policy and engineering. We don't all have to be working on everything either, by the way. The one thing we're not short of on this planet is people. You know, some people work on this problem, some people are working on that problem, but they're not the same problem. And so I'd like to address this idea that is out there that it's too late. I heard David Suzuki recently said it's too late. Too late for what? Yeah, it's probably too late to stop the warming at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, but the climate modelers tell us it's not too late to stop before 2 degrees. And consider this, if we burn all of the remaining well-known fossil fuel reserves, and there may be more that we don't know about, but if we burn all the ones we do know about, the global climate will increase, global temperature will increase by an average of 8 degrees over the whole world. So forget about the 1.5 degree target, the 2 degree target, 8 degrees. And in Canada, particularly northern Canada, that would be more like 17 degrees. So it's not too late to stop that. We just have to figure out what to do. And there are different kinds of climate mitigation actions we can take. And you won't be surprised to hear that I think there are 3. The first kind is stopping fossil fuel emissions. Once we stop adding ancient carbon into the modern carbon system, the warming will stop. It will stop within years. It won't go back to where it was. It won't go down. The climate is not going to cool on a time scale that is relevant to humans. If we wait 100,000 years, sure, but for now, it's not going to go down from there, but it will stop at that point. Then the second kind is nature-based solutions, including blue carbon. They don't have a very large potential to make an effect, but they can do something. There is potentially short-term, particularly some of the things like forests, which have larger potential than blue carbon. But they can draw down a little bit of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the trees. Sure, it's short-term, and it's insecure, and a forest fire could wipe it out. But in the short term, we could draw down some of this CO2 out of the atmosphere, where it's causing all the warming and these changes in our climate that we're noticing. And it might buy us time to consider what else we want to do next. So that leads us to the third category, which is the large-scale geoengineering. So I was mentioning those before, the example of alkalinization of the ocean, or drawing down the CO2 and liquefying it, putting it in basalt. That one was an idea that came up in Iceland. They have a really good place to test that out because they've got new crust, new basalt forming on the surface all the time, and they can inject this in. And it does appear that the liquid CO2 will react chemically with the new basalt rocks and form a hard mineral. This is not the same as carbon capture and storage, where they're just injecting gas or down below into the cracks in the rock and hoping they don't come back out. This is different. It's actually forming a solid rock and potentially could last essentially forever from a human timescale. And there's going to be an experiment in a few years just off our coast as well, where there's some relatively fresh ocean crust. But the thing with these big processes is that they've only been tried in very tiny experiments, and we don't know how well they'll scale up. And we also don't know all the risks. We know some of the risks, but there are going to be other things that we haven't anticipated that might happen if we do those things. So it's definitely not going to be a decision of scientists whether we should do them or not. This is going to be a decision for policymakers and all of society to decide, once we get to the point where we've stopped fossil fuel emissions and the climate is not warming anymore, and we've done what we can with nature-based solutions, Are we satisfied with the climate where it is, or do we want to take the risk of one of the large scale interventions as well to make a larger difference? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do know that it's going to be easier for people to make decisions if they are informed and they understand that different actions have different possible effects. And I think it's useful to just explain that and just calm people down a little bit, help to relieve some of that anxiety where it feels like everything's mixed together, but it's actually not all mixed together. These are different problems, different solutions. And then there's one more action that I think that people like to know about what they can do locally as well, because these other interventions are very large scale. And yes, we can do our bit for climate mitigation by driving less, taking transit, taking bikes, walking, that sort of thing. But most of the climate change mitigation actions are going to be much larger, global scale things. And locally, people might want to know what else they can do. So besides mitigation, there's adaptation. We can do things to help reduce the effects. Obviously, there are adaptations for humans on land. That's way outside of my expertise. But in thinking of the ocean, the marine ecosystems are stressed by climate change and at the same time by all our local human activities. The sea creatures are stressed by habitat destruction and pollution and fishing and noise and traffic. All those things are on top of climate change. And anything that we can do to reduce some of the local pressures can help the animals to be resilient to the larger pressure of climate change. So there are some good examples where people have done something locally that has made a change. For example, salmon stream restoration projects. There are lots of examples around BC where people have cleared blockages from streams and salmon have come back for the first time in years. So that's something local people can do. And just not polluting an area anymore, that can help too. For example, that in Howe Sound, the crab fishery was closed for many years because of pollution from dioxins and furans. But the dioxin and furan supply was cut off, and eventually, over the course of about a decade, the environment was able to clean itself up. Basically, sedimentation eventually buried the dioxins and furans, and the crabs stopped eating such contaminated sediment, and the crab fishery has been opened again in Howe Sound. There are other stories like that too. So those don't help to mitigate climate change, but they are things that we can do to lessen the effects. And I think that the message I finally want to leave you with is climate change is well underway now. This is not a problem for the future. It's already happening. We're already seeing the effects, but there's lots more yet to come. And the bad news, good news story in this is the bad news is, yes, humans are causing this problem. But the good news is humans are causing this problem. So we are the ones who have the ability to do something about it. And really, what we decide to do is up to us. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
So, 2 questions. Of all the choices that you have discussed tonight in this very, very nice lecture, if you had, first question is, if you had $1 million this year, what would you invest in? What would be your favorite? And the second question is, if you had $1 million a year for 10 years, or $10 million for 10 years, long term, what would you invest in? What would be your choice?
Okay, so the first part of this answer, and I need you all to be sure you hear it so that you can back me up later. I'm a civil servant, so I have no opinion. Okay, said that. So I can't say what we should do, and I prefer not to say publicly what I would do either. But I guess just to be clear, government scientists aren't allowed to comment on policy, but we are allowed and encouraged to speak within our expertise. So what I can speak to is what we could do and not necessarily what would be the best. And in fact, it's not really in my expertise to know what you could buy for $1 million. But since the climate change mitigation measures, like nature-based solutions and the geoengineering, those are things that will only have small effects relative to the effect of stopping making the problem worse. So anything we can do to stop making the problem worse, like investing in renewables or anything that will replace fossil fuels or stop us from getting fossil fuels into the atmosphere would be more effective than immediately going for remediation. Yes.
What do you say about nuclear?
Well,
Can you
okay.
Can you repeat the
Okay,
question?
yes. The question was, what do you say about nuclear? So, again, no opinions offered here, just the fact. Nuclear isn't a big problem from a carbon perspective. I mean, I suppose the concrete that's used in building it emits a certain amount of carbon. The problem with nuclear is what to do with the waste. That's a different kind of problem.
But it's minimal. The waste is minimal.
The waste, there may not be very much of it, it can be really tiny, but those isotopes have a half-life on the order of 1 billion years, so whatever we decide to do with it needs to be long-term. They certainly nuclear doesn't cause climate change in the way that fossil fuels do.
Yeah, I think that's the way we gotta go. Sorry.
Yeah.
So coming back to your comment about magnitude, this alkalization of the oceans is rather fascinating. I mean, has anybody run the numbers? Is there enough limestone or dolomite on the planet that you're gonna actually make a dent in the pH of the oceans by sprinkling carbonates into it?
So the question is whether alkalinization of the ocean is feasible in terms of whether there's enough limestone around to make the ocean sufficiently alkaline to make a dent. So not my area of expertise. I understand that yes, theoretically it could make a very large difference. About the numbers I've seen are by 2100, and this is, by the way, in the world of frictionless pulleys and everything being ideal and perfect, but by 2100, the drawdown of CO2 from ocean alkalinization could be something like about half of the excess CO2 that's currently in the atmosphere. But that's not taking reality into account at all. So whether there's enough limestone, I think that they've worked out that there is, but how you get it to the ocean is a really big problem. Where do you, how do we mine enough and grind it up and get it there without using fossil fuel energy like trucks and things? So, and also there's the social license problem for that. But there's an experiment going on currently in Halifax Harbour where they've been doing this now for a few years, and they seem to be quite confident that it's working. And so that's as far as I can go with what I know about it, but I suggest if you're interested, you just look up the literature on ocean alkalinization and read more about it. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, there's lots of carbonate in the ocean in the form of pelagic calcareous ooze. The problem is the time scale and the dissolution kinetics, which says that you can remove about 85% of the carbon of the CO2 by carbonate dissolution, but the time scale is several thousands of years. That's the problem.
Thank you. Did I need to repeat that one, or is that close enough to the microphone? Okay. Oh yeah, way at the back there are two. So you pick who wants to go first.
Just wanted you to see them.
Oh.
How do you handle the countries that are unwilling to change? I'm thinking China, India, and the US.
Yeah, so that unfortunately is a political question, and I have no expertise to answer it. All we can do as scientists is keep finding out find out what we can about what's happening and what we can do about it, and then try and speak clearly to explain that, and then it's going to be up to other people to do the convincing. Yes?
Could ocean fertilization to stimulate more photosynthesis in the middle of the ocean work, or would all that carbon get gobbled up and then just re-emitted as CO2 on the way down?
Yeah, so this question was about ocean fertilization and whether we could, you were asking about fertilization with iron, right?
Or anything, really. Can you promote more photosynthesis in the middle of the ocean and hope that some of that ends up being buried long term? Or is that a pipe dream?
So the question was whether you can fertilize with iron or something in the middle of the ocean to make more primary production and hope that some of the phytoplankton will sink. You can do exactly that, but there's a big piece of hope in there, and it's actually quite a complicated situation because yes, the experiments have shown that if you sprinkle iron in certain areas of the ocean that have plenty of other nutrients, they've got plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus and silicate, but they don't have enough iron. If you add iron there, you can make more phytoplankton grow. But there is so far no evidence at all that any of that ends up at the bottom of the ocean stored long term. And in the meantime, there are all sorts of potential effects, like changing the ecosystem structure, developing a superbug, making an oxygen desert beneath it, because the additional production would then be consumed in the water column, largely using up oxygen. And then the other thing is that in most parts of the ocean, even if there are excess nutrients of the nitrogen phosphorus type in some part of the ocean, the water doesn't stay in one place, it moves around. Eventually, most of those nutrients get used somewhere before the water sinks down again. So, and the final thing on that is it's illegal. So, under a couple of different United Nations conventions. But I know it's something that it's all these things that's another, you could consider it a nature-based solution or a geoengineering, but all these ones that involve biology seem so hopeful because we just want them to be. They really would, it would be wonderful if they were true, but so far we don't have any of those that are working on large scale.
Okay, maybe just two more.
Well, we were talking about like the ocean fertilization in class one day, and like talking about a lot of the negative impacts, but we were kind of talking about the possibility of bringing that like on land, and like creating like something that would act as like a space for or like plankton to, I guess, live, and then creating in like an on land carbon storage, like using phytoplankton. I don't know, like.
So the question was about the possibility of doing ocean iron fertilization, but in tanks on land, I think.
Like farm, like fish farm?
Yeah, so I've never heard that idea before, and so perhaps I'm not fully understanding it, but I think the problem there would be scale, that you just, I don't think you could do it on a big enough scale to make that work, and you still have the time scale problem too, of how do you store that carbon long term.
Okay, just to her thing, what about fish farms?
The question is what about fish farms, but in what way what about farms?
Well, she was talking about how to adapt to the regeneration of the health of the ocean. And I was just saying, what about fish farms? Are you against them or are you for them?
I would say neither in that case. Also, I'm a public servant. Opinion on fish farms.
Sorry to put you there, but I just like, you know, it's, I don't know.
Yes, and yeah, and I'm afraid that really is outside my expertise too. I don't have a lot of expertise in fish farms, but sure, it's a very interesting topic. Now, Casey said, I think we're out of questions, but there's one hand there. What do you think? Are we?
Up to you.
Oh yeah, sure, I'll take it.
Well, I was just thinking, because I work for the BC government, I produced the climate change accountability report, and we were talking a bit about the use of kind of basically offsetting emissions, and so the BC government is carbon neutral, and I'm going to say that it's carbon neutral because that's what we say, because we offset our carbon. But it was quite very interesting when you saying that's really what it does, is actually release more carbon, because not burning something and not releasing something is not the same as not producing. And I was just wondering, like, I guess you can't really answer this in the same way that you're a big servant. But what would you recommend as organisations do instead of that? What would be better policies?
Yeah, so I can answer that without recommending.
Yeah.
So what I can say is that, so the question was about carbon offsets in the BC government. The BC government says it's carbon neutral because they offset their carbon emissions. And the question was whether if that offset is due to protecting something existing and then balancing that against emissions, it's not actually net neutral. And so what would be better? What I'd say is the only thing that actually offsets fossil fuel emission is reducing taking away fossil fuel emissions somewhere else. So that's a kind of the cap and trade system actually will balance. If you say we're emitting here, we're drawing down here in some way, but certainly trying to balance emissions against no change is not achieving what you want. And balancing emissions in one place against biological drawdown is a kind of net zero, but it's not net zero on a timescale of longer than about 100 years. And maybe not that, depending on where exactly it is. It might be a season or a year. Okay, thanks for all those great questions, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Before we go, I do have a couple of announcements. So, of course, we'll have another Café Scientifique in December 9th, and it will be Dr. Andrew Frass from the School of Earth and Ocean Science at UVic, and he is a micropaleontologist. So he looks at the bugs, the fossils of the bugs in the mud. We also have a couple of events that might be of interest to you. On November 20th, we're having Dr. John Kominowski, a Fulbright scholar. His talk is Lesson in Disturbance and Restoration from Long-Term Ecological Restoration in the Florida Everglades. So November 20th at UVic. Also at UVic on November 26th, we have a book launch with Dr. John Willis. Physics. The Pale Blue Dot Data Point, an Earth-based perspective on the search for alien life. Diversity of topics. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this evening.